There are probably few teams in the Big Ten right now that kind of have the buzz around them that the Nebraska Cornhuskers do this season. They are looking to be one of those teams that is going to take a giant step forward. And to help us kind of take a look at what this team is going to do in the coming year, we have brought on a very special guest today. He is Luke Mullin. He covers the Cornhuskers very beautifully, I might add. Wrote an excellent story about them reporting to camp, covered all sorts of interesting stuff that was talked about this week as they're kind of getting ready for the season. And we are thrilled to have him on Big Ten Country today. Luke, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Certainly an exciting time. Fall practice, fall camp just starting up. And of course, I'm sure we'll get into it, but Dylan Raiola, a lot of excitement around him and this entire Nebraska football team.
We may as well get started with him. I think that his name is on everybody's lips. Last season, it was Matt Rhule, and everybody was talking about how he was going to kind of revolutionize the Cornhusker program, but now all eyes are on Dylan. And, I mean, he's made waves already, comes in looking exactly like Patrick Mahomes, lights social media on fire, was reading that he even kind of models his game after Mahomes a little bit. I have a feeling I know the answer to this question, but before we kind of get to the will he, won't he start kind of thing, I just want to know, what's the buzz like in Lincoln around this guy right now?
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, even when he was coming on campus as a recruit, he went to like a basketball game. People were there asking him for autographs. I mean, he was at a baseball game. People were lining up, and this was before he was even at Nebraska. So, I mean, kid's a superstar in every aspect of the world. For here in Nebraska. And in terms of his work, getting into the locker room, developing those chemistry, those relationships with his teammates, glowing reviews certainly from them in terms of the work that he's put in. And especially too, in terms of his attitude, you could get 5-star coming in, somewhere, you could be cocky, you could have that demeanor of, hey, I'm just going to be the starter. But Matt Rhule, he's made it very clear that Raiola is going to have to earn that. And I think in his demeanor, the way he goes about his work, that's been reflected. And certainly, he's a high level kid. He has these aspirations, to get to that next level, to be that NFL quarterback. And yes, I saw the fit, I saw him looking like Mahomes, rolling up into the dorms, but he trained with Mahomes over the summer. He was working out with his trainer there down in Kansas City. They have a good relationship, those two. So I think there's a lot of good for him to emulate if he wants to be a little mini Patrick Mahomes.
Luke, how soon do you believe Dylan will become the starter? But also for people that hadn't seen him in high school, and of course we can use the Mahomes comp, but what style of player is he? And what are his pluses and his minuses? I guess pros and cons is the type of player he is for people that haven't seen him play through high school.
Yeah, great question. I mean, there's a reason why he's a 5-star, one of the top quarterback recruits in the whole country, and that's arm talent. It's the be all end all. He has a cannon for an arm. And I will say, just seeing him throw in person, he's one of those guys that just kind of has an effortless throwing motion. He can just stand there, like hardly step into a throw, loft it 40 yards down the field, exactly where he wants it to go. So certainly he has that high level football ability. I think the question here early on is going to be, how quickly can he acclimate to this offense? How quickly is he going to go through his reads? How good is his decision making? Because that's something that obviously a lot of young players struggle with, and especially at the quarterback position. If he is going to be that day one starter that we here in Lincoln do believe he is going to be, he's going to have to come along quickly here in these fall practices. And in terms of that starting decision, Matt Rhule, he's a smart veteran about the way that he's going to play this. I think he understands that if he were to name Raiola the starter, he's going to have 4 weeks of discussion about him. The spotlight is going to be on him. I think I would not expect that decision to come through until at very least the week of the first game day there, heading up in August, just because he wants to play by the book. Matt Rhule does. He doesn't want to put too much pressure on Raiola's shoulders. So I think he's going to keep that decision through to the end of fall camp.
I like the way you explain that, where it's not so much as like trying to keep film off the board or try to keep like UTEP on their toes. That's not exactly something you're trying to do with a team like that. But certainly, hey, in fairness to the other guys too, and kind of minimizing distractions. I did want to talk a little bit more about his offseason work. You had mentioned he'd worked with Mahomes. I also had read quite a bit, including from you, about the way he kind of ingratiated himself with his teammates and really kind of started building chemistry in the stretch run leading up to the season. You talk a little bit more about kind of the way his teammates have received him as he's come into Lincoln as this highly heralded prospect?
Yeah, I think just talking to, some of the offensive linemen, the wide receivers, the guys who are going to be working very closely with him, they said he's just another one of the guys. He's not somebody that's coming in with an inflated sense of ego or anything like that. And certainly when we are in this era of college football, with big money NIL deals, it's something that you could expect, right? A guy to come in, and think that he's made it already, but that's not been the case. And certainly in the spring initially, before Nebraska was on campus for his January workouts, Raiola came early. He came a couple days early, started working out with a few of the wide receivers who are already on campus. So that was a great start. I mean, if you're there, that's what a leader does, right? They show up early, they stay late, all those different platitudes that coaches throw out there all the time. And they've been very gracious and complimentary of Raiola's work. Matt Rhule said, sometimes I show up there 6 a.m. Dylan's already in there in the weight room. And it's like, okay. I mean, you hear that kind of stuff, those kind of stories, and it just makes you clear, how much kind of a work ethic that he has. And of course, we've heard that's something that he's learned from his father, Dominic Raiola, former NFL offensive lineman. His teammates have said, Dylan likes to tell stories about how he grew up, in the Lions locker room, how he's, running on the field, as a young kid. So you just have somebody out there whose life has been shaped by professional football, by high level football, who understands what it takes to be a great player at this level. And so far, so good in terms of just how he's gone about preparing and getting towards that ultimate goal.
Ken, can you and I have a moment to know when he was talking about running around on the Lions field, he wasn't talking about the Silverdome. He was talking about Ford Field. Can we just have that old man moment here for a second?
Old man moment. But even James, I'm happy you said that. And I'm sorry, Luke, because I'm because of Ben Johnson, I'm not the biggest Jared Goff guy, and shout out to Jared Goff, but the fear that you've instilled in me with the Lions actually having their stuff together, and the thought, because the thing about it, and I'm okay, so just so you know, Luke, you don't know us, I'm a huge Patrick Mahomes guy. I nicknamed him Baby Goat. All right.
Mm-hmm.
So any comparison to him is basically disrespectful. But I was looking at Dylan's highlights, and it's something that young players do now. And one of our co-hosts, Josh Schrock, we talk about this on our Bears podcast. The layering that young quarterbacks are able to do now is ridiculous, and I don't think people talk about it a lot. The ball placement through layering, and I saw Dylan throw this pass down the sideline into the end zone where only the receiver can get it. And it's one thing to have arm strength. It's another thing to have strength and, like you said, the ease with how he passes it. But to be able, because a lot of guys have to rocket it in a Josh Allen fashion. But to be able to, that's to me why Mahomes is better. Josh Allen has a stronger arm than Patrick Mahomes, but Patrick Mahomes can put it in places that a lot of people couldn't. But anyway, enough of that. Getting back to this with Dylan and my real question for you. One of the things that we've harped on a lot last season, and we may be putting the cart in front of the horse here, but I've never been one to believe that Nebraska can return to being Nebraska. But I think Matt Rhule may actually be able to get it as close to Tom Osborne's Nebraska than I've ever seen. And I want this to sit on Dylan. What does Dylan's commitment to the school mean, getting such a star-studded recruit that Nebraska hasn't had in years? What does it mean? But also, who's the last player that you can remember that that caused this type of commotion committing to Nebraska?
Yeah, good question. I mean, honestly, it's kind of a tale of near misses, I think, of big recruits, who drew a lot of attention. I can remember Micah Parsons was on campus. He went through a camp, and I think there was like 2,000 people showed up, watched Micah Parsons work out. And of course, he didn't end up at Nebraska. But I think he was the most like high profile recruit, within the last like 5 to 7 years that Nebraska really had such a chance of landing. And to your point about Raiola, I mean, the impact has been instantaneous. Even in the previous recruiting class that just came by, the 2024 class that he was a part of, I mean, as soon as he committed, he was calling recruits, he was texting guys. There were a few like 5 stars. He was like trying to get to campus for a visit, like to flip, in like the last week that he could even do it. I mean, he was clearly committed to building up this Nebraska football program for the future, and that has carried over. These recent weeks, there's been multiple 5-star recruits who've come to Nebraska. And before Raiola, I think it had been about 10 to 15 years before Nebraska had landed an athlete of that caliber in the recruiting rankings. So just this last week, a week ago, David Sanders, the top overall 2025 offensive line prospect, he was considering Ohio State, Georgia, Tennessee, these huge programs, big time NIL budgets. Well, Raiola, he jumped on Twitter. He said, "Hey, Husker fans, like come to the airport, come to the stadium, like show this guy some love." I mean, he's a very smart, strategic guy about how he goes about building these connections and furthering this Nebraska football program on that recruiting trail. Because I think, it's still early, right? Because he wants guys who are going to buy in. But let's say Raiola goes out there this season, throws 25 touchdowns, looks like the phenomenal player that he is. Well, that's going to carry through to the offseason. There's going to be a lot of people interested in playing with him if he does succeed and play well at this level.
It all just seems to me this confluence of events that are kind of indicative of a cultural shift in Lincoln. And I think that another thing that has really stood out to me about Matt Rhule this offseason is that while all this stuff is going on, he's still wanting to test the guys that he has in camp. I've seen a quote where he wanted simply put tough players to go into this season. I think when you're 5-7, you're kind of looking for any edge you can get, but it really does seem like he's trying to like instill this mentality, and it's becoming pervasive throughout the entire team. And there is this incredible level of buy-in. Is that the sense that you're getting observing the way that Matt Rhule is kind of putting this thing together?
Absolutely. And I think, to kind of dive into that situation, we got to back up a little bit and take it back to the Scott Frost era. There was, I think, under Frost, the recruiting that Nebraska was doing was not any worse off. The talent that was coming into this program, I don't think was any worse off than what it is now. What was missing was development and relationships, huge amongst that. I think there were a lot of players on the team who didn't feel like they wanted to give their full effort, or, they weren't as close to the coaches as maybe they'd hoped. So at times, especially late in that 2022 season, or I should say early, I guess he got fired pretty early on, Scott Frost did, but it was a fragmented locker room. And that's just the reality of the situation. Guys who believed in Frost wanted to keep him, guys who were, sick and tired of the way that things were done. So Matt Rhule comes in, and he's inheriting a lot of guys, who of course, didn't commit to play for him, don't know the way that he wants to run things. And what Rhule said from day one early on was, I'm going to be honest with them. And so if there was a guy who, former 4-star recruit who they look at his tape and they say, you're not going to play for us. I mean, they were going to tell him that. They were not going to mince words. They understood that an overhaul was needed. So in recruiting from the high school level, that was a huge instant transformation. They got a ton of freshmen on the field last year. They're very big about the long-term development of those guys. And these guys that are redshirt freshmen, sophomores now, I mean, they are the future of this Nebraska program. And behind the scenes too, I think just speaking with a lot of people around the program and throughout the state, I mean, Rhule and his assistant coaches, they went out to Nebraska. They went to the small towns. I mean, that places of 1,000, 1,500 people, like towns that have not sent a Nebraska football scholarship player in 20, 30 years. And you go, well, what's the point of that? Well, it's to build relationships, to make sure that everybody throughout the state knows that Nebraska football cares about these communities, that they have their support. And I think that's certainly been reflected in the energy that a lot of people have been putting in towards this program. And just the way that things are handled, I can just say around the building, the coaches, they're fantastic people, great to work with, and the relationships that they've built with players and people outside the program, I think, are very strong. So there's a lot of energy. I think a lot of hopeful optimism that this coaching staff is doing things the right way and that they're really building a strong foundation.
Definitely secure your state is first thing you have to do, particularly when you think about how great Nebraska has been in the past. Luke, you mentioned development and the differences between Scott Frost and now the new regime with Matt Rhule. Have players highlighted the differences in development, but also, and it may be too early, how has NIL impacted Nebraska on this new regime and what they hope will be the new beginning to return back to greatness?
Yeah, so for the first part, in terms of the development, I think it's been, to me, it's been less of a case of doing things differently and more a case of changing the focus, I guess, in terms of the on-field perspective, because Scott Frost, in a big way, his coaching staff, they were all about speed. They wanted these speedy guys out on the field, these offensive skill positions. They wanted these big maulers along the offensive line. Well, Matt Rhule, he's not so different. He wants the same thing, right? He's spoken about wanting a positionless offense, skill position guys who can go all over. But the big difference, I think, has been the offensive line, the difference of the training that they've been doing in the trenches. And this was something that was going on for several years under the previous coaching staff. Was the focus in the weight room was add as much strength as possible. I mean, they were having competitions, of course, and this stuff goes on everywhere, right? I mean, you want to maximize your lifts, you want to get strong and big, right? But I think it was going to the point where the strength was the focus and not being the best version of themselves on the field. And so Matt Rhule comes in, and the first guy that he brought with him was his strength coach, Corey Campbell. He was on the plane with Matt Rhule that landed in Lincoln in day one for that press conference that he came here, his first day as a Husker. Corey Campbell was there, the strength coach. And that's because Matt Rhule saw that this program, it needed physical development in terms of that overhaul in the strength room. And so speaking to the offensive linemen, really the focus has changed from adding as much strength to flexibility, like being able to move, being able to bend, like to move laterally, go side to side. I mean, there were several offensive linemen that quickly shed 10, 15, 20 pounds just because they were at heavier weights than what they needed to be at for this offensive scheme, this offensive system. And then, working in tandem with that, I think too, is just the focus on getting young players on the field. I mean, under Scott Frost, there were tons of 4-star freshmen, sophomores, just didn't see the field. And you go, well, they didn't develop, right? Well, is that their fault or is that the coaching staff's fault? So it could have been a little bit of both, but you just got to get those guys in positions to succeed early, get them on the field. That has been this coaching staff's focus. So that has been huge. And quickly to wrap up your second point to NIL, Nebraska right now is not, I think, in a situation where it can compete with some of these top programs nationally. It has a strong NIL budget for what it needs to compete in the Big Ten, to be a strong program that can recruit with the top 20, top 25 recruiting class as they have been. But to me, it's been more of a case where Nebraska has wanted to use NIL to keep players on its roster rather than to pursue high-level transfers or different big money recruits. And of course, don't worry, Dylan Raiola, he got his bag. Don't worry, they made sure of it. But they were looking at a transfer quarterback, and that wasn't right for them. They had done it a year ago with Jeff Sims. They paid him a big NIL deal to come here. It did not work. It was a miserable failure. Lots of turnovers. He's now at Arizona State. Quickly moved on there. So I think really the focus was just, hey, keep these guys on the roster happy, and we'll see what goes from there.
Ken and I have connections to various teams. I'm a pretty big Arizona State fan. I have a lot of family out in Phoenix. And so you describing Jeff Sims as a miserable failure was really a kick in the gut. I didn't need that today, Luke. Thanks.
I think you may be a backup at Arizona State, so you might be all right there.
Well, knowing my luck, he'll be the starter in week 2 and everything will go horribly. And I'll be in Cincinnati watching the Sun Devils play with a bottle of Malort in my hand. But anyway, we're not going to talk about all that right now. We're going to try to focus on the task at hand here. And I do want to drill down, man, this interview's really threatening to go off the rails. You're hitting us with a lot of really emotional thoughts here, Luke. I did want to ask you about the team's wide receivers, because this was an area that I felt like they made some really interesting moves in the transfer portal to bring in some guys that I think could be really solid pass catchers, whether it is presumably for Dylan this season, or if there's another guy who ends up starting. I'm not going to guarantee that he'll be starting, but I would imagine he is. I think that there are some really interesting names in that wide receiver room, and I have heard talk about the depth being really greatly improved at Nebraska and kind of giving them more flexibility, and you're not just going to be handing the ball off to Gabe Urban every single time. Can you talk a little bit about that wide receiver depth and kind of the development of that?
Yeah, I think when you look back at the 2023 season for Nebraska, I mean, the passing game was abysmal. I mean, it was just one of the worst nationally. There were several games late in the year they threw for about 150 yards a game, and well, part of that is, of course, on the quarterback position, but a really big part of it was the wide receivers. They just simply could not create separation last year. There weren't many windows for the Nebraska quarterbacks to throw into. So I think even more than overhauling the quarterback position and bringing in Dylan Raiola, it was the position in the offseason that they knew they needed to get better at. And it was not get better by adding, a freshman, who's going to need 2 or 3 years, to maybe develop to become, an all-around dominant wide receiver. It was get better now. And so they did just that. 2 seniors, 2 experienced guys coming in, Jamal Banks. He came from Wake Forest, spent 4 years there. And then Isaiah Nayer, who had a really good year at Wyoming, transferred to Texas. Injuries had limited him over the last 2 years, toward an ACL that took him a long time to come back from. And those 2 guys, they are expected to be the veteran pass catchers, leaders of this group. And particularly Jamal Banks, I think, is the guy who folks are expecting big things out of, because he's a big target, 6'4", 220, moves really well. Just seeing him in practice, I mean, he can run all the different routes. He was running slants and the linebackers couldn't keep up. He's running the go routes and the DBs couldn't deal with him. I mean, he's a matchup problem. And particularly with Raiola's deep ball, I think those 2 are going to be trouble. And Nayer, he's another guy. He's from the same mold, pretty big, physical wide receiver as well, with good downfield speed. So those 2 are leading the lines. But to your point, I mean, the depth is something that they've been focusing on, because this position last year, I mean, by the end of the season, I mean, Nebraska was playing freshmen, former walk-ons. I mean, it was really dire straits with who is going to be getting those snaps at wide receiver. So a guy who really flashed last year, he was a freshman, Jalen Lloyd, in-state kid here, grew up in Omaha. He had 5 catches and 3 touchdown passes last year. I mean, that's how good he was as a big play threat. So he's going to be big time for him. Malachi Coleman, another in-state guy, a sophomore, is there. And then there's some veterans too. Isaiah Garcia Castaneda coming off an ACL. Alex Bullock, he's a guy who's been in the program for a couple of years. They'll rotate in, but expect to see a lot of Banks, Nayer, and Lloyd. Those are the 3 to watch out for.
Nebraska was tied in committing turnovers last season. You highlighted it in your article. What has Matt Rhule said about turning that around and putting a button on the amount of turnovers that they had, so they can win a lot more games than they did last season with just 5?
Yeah, it's kind of funny, because Matt Rhule, he's very much a pragmatic coach. He's not going to focus in, I think, on anything that predated him. But these turnover troubles, I mean, this has been a decade's worth of just absolutely horrible turnover issues for Nebraska. I mean, across coaching staffs, across quarterbacks, players, personnel. I mean, it just defies logic, right? At some point, about how bad they've been in turnovers. But specifically for him and for this current Nebraska football team, they're going to practice the heck out of it. I think that's the only way to get better, right? I mean, they've been doing ball security drills. That's something that they've talked about a lot. On defense, they're going to focus about rallying to the ball, punching the ball out. I mean, it's got to be a comprehensive, overall thing that they do, because it's not just going to be like, hey, let's spend, an hour in practice and our turnover issues are solved. I mean, that's just simply not going to happen. So I do think the quarterback position, this is going to be the place where these turnover improvements could happen. And I am a little bit worried because of Raiola's arm talent. I get the sense that he might try to force some passes, really push the ball downfield, maybe more so than the quick hitting, short passing game. So maybe on to the offensive coordinator, to protect his quarterback a little bit, make sure that the play calls reflect that. But, there weren't a ton of running backs just, getting hit and fumbling the ball last year. That wasn't the turnovers. It was the quarterback position. And all three quarterbacks who played for Nebraska last year, they lost fumbles. They threw interceptions. I mean, it was all three guys. So really, I think it's going to be up to Raiola. As crazy as that sounds, I mean, it's the 18-year-old freshman who's going to need to overhaul this offense and make sure that things do not go as askew as they did last year.
Yeah, we try not to talk as much about last season. We know, obviously, the season did not end the way that Husker fans wanted it to end. In your mind, do you think that the improvements that they've made on the offensive side of the football and the fact that they have so many returning players on the defensive side of things, and honestly, a really, I think, kind of unheralded defense in a lot of ways, at least from a national perspective, do you think that's going to be enough to really kind of give them a big step forward this season and, dare I say, get back to a bowl game, perhaps?
I knew it was coming, and the answer is yes.
It has to come, man.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I predict they'll make it to a bowl game for what that's worth, and of course they were almost there last year, before they choked at the end of the season. So there's no guarantees, certainly, but yes, I mean, you look at the defense, and as you said, I mean, this was a top 15, top 20 defense nationally last year. In scoring, and they were a top 5 team in run defense, top 20 in sacks. I mean, so many different metrics that they excelled at, and really the defense is what dragged last year's team to 5 wins. So, I mean, I expect this defense to be just as good, if not better. So that's a 5-win, 6-win team on account of its defense, and of course, you can lose games on the offensive side of the ball. Don't get me wrong. Plenty of teams do. Nebraska has done that certainly many times. But as long as they get, in my eyes, average to above average quarterback play out of Dylan Raiola, as long as the running backs are solid and the wide receivers can do their job, yeah, this should easily be a bowl team. And when you look at their schedule too, people always in the offseason, as we say around here in Nebraska, they're always drinking the Kool-Aid. But people look at the schedule, and really the schedule is easy. The first half of the Nebraska schedule could easily shape up for 5-2 would be the baseline. I mean, 6-1, people are talking about 7-0, which I think is a little bit of a stretch, perhaps. Tough game at Colorado, a couple conference games too, but there's no reason why this Nebraska team shouldn't make a bowl. And the only reason that would keep them is the defense regressing or the offense not showing the progress it needs to under Raiola.
He has to get out of here. I'm not holding him.
It is kind of a crazy schedule. We've talked a lot about teams in the Big Ten facing rough hauls this year. Nebraska's schedule is right there for the tanking. Like, they could take a really big step forward. And Luke, we really appreciate the way you've broken it all down for us. Put up with our nonsense. Ken and I apparently were feeling some kind of way today.
You guys had to relive the glory days. I was just here for the ride.
That is absolute nonsense. You directed this ship more than you could possibly realize, sir. Luke Mullin, really great stuff. Really appreciate having you on. You can find his work in the Lincoln Journal-Star. He's on X at LJS Luke. Thank you so much for joining us, man. We really did enjoy this conversation, and we would love to have you back on in the future to talk about Nebraska. Maybe that Colorado game. Perhaps we'll get you on here sooner than we would think.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Look forward to chatting again soon.
Congrats, you finished the video. If you want to build on that success, download the NBC Sports Chicago app. It's got highlights, exclusive insights, and push alerts tailored to you. Everything you need to be a real Chicago sports fan. Download it now.